Brilliant. I love this place. We do our innovation awards here, and that gallery down there, you probably had to walk through to get here, the Making the Modern World, is without a doubt the best history of technology gallery on the planet. It's got the first telegraph, it's got the first electron tube, it's got the first steam engine, it's got Babbage's mechanical computer, it's got the first Apple. You name it, it's there. It's absolutely fantastic. But we're not here today to talk about the past. We're here to talk about the future. And I'm obsessed with the future and what it looks like. And I find that looking at the past is an extremely valuable way to figure out what the future might look like. Sometimes I look back a very long way. I just wrote a book about how social media started with the Romans, for example. Sometimes I look back not quite so far. The Victorians had an internet, the telegraph. You can see the Cook and Wheatstone telegraph downstairs if you want to. But I think actually in the digital age, it's worth even looking back over the scale of a decade to see what we can figure out. So I'm going to be talking about some technologies that I think are worth keeping an eye on. But before we start, can anyone tell me what the one four-letter word, and it's not a rude word, that links these two pictures here, one from 2005 and one from 2013? Yes, Pope, indeed. The top is the announcement that the new Pope will be Pope Benedict, and the bottom one is the announcement it will be Pope Francis. And you can see that in the top picture, there's one teeny-weeny mobile phone at the bottom right-hand corner. And in the bottom picture, absolutely everyone has got a phone, and there's even some sad person taking a picture with an iPad, which is not a good look. But anyway, you can see this is an amazing transformation that's happened over the course of just 8 years, that smartphones have gone from being pretty obscure to being ubiquitous. And they clearly have disrupted an enormous number of industries. I mean, they disrupted the telecoms industry, but they also disrupted the software industry and the camera industry and the PC industry and the music industry and the TV industry and the video games industry and the newspaper industry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, they're a very big deal. I think what happened to Kodak and Nokia. So the interesting thing is the signs were there if you knew where to look. So I don't know about you, but I've been covering technology for a while, and one of the things I did in 2001, along with lots of other Westerners, was go to Tokyo to see 3G phones. At the time, they were the only place in the world you could see them, and they really worked, and there were about 40 of them in the top floor of a building, Docomo's building in Tokyo. And that, at the time, was like half the mobile phones, the 3G mobile phones on Earth were in that room. And, but they actually worked. And the idea was that if you knew where to look, you could see a glimpse of the future. This is an idea that's been beautifully encapsulated by the science fiction writer William Gibson. He says the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And that's an example, me going to Tokyo, Western telecoms people going to Tokyo to see it. This is the sort of thing we did. In fact, for a while, Wired magazine had a feature called Japanese Schoolgirl Watch, which sounds a bit dodgy, but the idea was that what Japanese schoolgirls do now, everyone else will be doing in a decade. So here's the question. What are the things that are obscure now, like mobile phones were 10 years ago? Because you could get mobile. I mean, I had that Nokia with the buttons arranged in a circle. Do you remember that one, the 3650? And it kind of had a camera. I mean, it was a rubbish camera. And it could kind of download apps. They were very small and not very clever. And it could kind of go on the internet very slowly. So it was sort of like a smartphone today. Obviously, they've got a lot better since. So there must be examples of kind of rubbish versions of technologies now that are going to be much better in a decade. Another way of looking at this is a quote from Paul Sappho, a futurologist. He says, it takes 20 years to become an overnight success. And it's absolutely true. I mean, you could see what happened with smartphones. The foundations were being built for things like the iPhone 15, 20 years ago with things like the invention of CDMA and miniaturization and so on and so on. And the same is true here. So that also means that there must be, the next big technologies must already be under development now. So what are they? I'm going to suggest 5 that you should keep an eye on. You probably are keeping an eye on already. But I also want to kind of follow through about what their implications really are, because I think in some cases they're rather counterintuitive. And I also want to consider what sorts of companies are best placed to benefit from each of these technologies, because it's not always who you might think. And I like this idea of the world in beta, because the thing about betas is you have to launch things that aren't quite ready, and you have to be prepared to adjust them in real time. And you just have to constantly, nothing is ever done. Nothing is ever finished. You just have to constantly be updating things. And I think that's how companies have to think. I think they need to be flexible to deal with these new technologies, and they need to be able to change their perception of what kind of company they are and what they do. And I'll come back to that as we go along. But a good example of this would be Amazon. Amazon, everyone thinks of them as a retailer, initially as a book retailer. They're really a giant technology company. They keep looking at things and saying, oh, we could do that. So they went into cloud computing, and they're now a leader in cloud computing. They invented customer reviews on the internet, pretty much. They were popularized because of Amazon. It's very easy to forget that. Clearly, they've pioneered ebooks as well. But essentially, they're not restrained by any kind of, oh, we can't do that because we're not that kind of company thinking. Conversely, Microsoft has been, for many years, constrained by the fact that it thinks of itself as the Windows company. The answer is Windows. Now, what's the question? Whatever you want to buy, we'll give you Windows. You want software for your car? Windows. You want software for your washing machine? Windows. And it was a pretty good answer for quite a lot of devices. It turned out to be not a very good answer for phones, and Microsoft is now having to re-evaluate how it thinks of itself. It is no longer the Windows company. It's now going to be a cloud, what's it, going to be a services and devices company. These are the two things it's historically been very bad at. It's been good at software, it's been rubbish at services, and rubbish at devices. So it's now trying to be the thing it was rubbish at. Good luck to them. Anyway, let's start with the first technology. We've had it mentioned already today, and it is the driverless car. Driverless cars are already here. The very interesting history of driverless cars is that DARPA, the research arm of the US government, had a competition in 2007. They challenged lots of people to build robotic vehicles that could drive over a 150-mile course. They essentially wanted devices, machines that could drive in Afghanistan and Iraq in military convoys and could deliver stuff to bases and wouldn't have people on board. And that way, if they drove over a mine, you wouldn't lose any people. So they thought, you know, obviously, challenge the world's computer scientists, America's computer scientists, to do this. They had the first of these challenges in 2004, and of the 15 vehicles that entered, the best of them managed to go 7 miles on the course, and the rest of them really didn't get off the starting line at all. It was a complete disaster, and DARPA must have thought, well, we've set the bar too high here. But even so, they had another competition the following year, and the really interesting thing was, in 2005, when they did this, all but one of the 23 vehicles that entered got further than 7 miles, and in fact, 5 of them finished the course. So this went from an insoluble problem in 2004 to a totally soluble problem in 2005. In fact, it was solved independently by 5 separate groups. And this was something that the car makers really sat up and paid attention to, because if 5 different groups of computer scientists could solve this problem, then they could probably do it too. And it turns out they all have. So this is a BMW that drives itself. It can drive itself over sort of tens of kilometers. There are cars you can buy today that can drive themselves for tens of kilometers. The Infiniti Q50, the Mercedes S-Class have a combination of adaptive cruise control, so they maintain a constant distance from the car in front, emergency braking, and lane keeping. And that means on a highway, when you're not faced with any emergencies and you're not trying to change, you know, get onto a different road or anything like that, they can basically drive themselves for quite long periods. There are also cars that have a traffic mode where they can drive themselves in stop-start traffic. So I think the perception is that we're going to, you know, you can buy cars that park themselves. I had a hilarious hire car this summer that could do all sorts of silly things like park itself. So the perception is we're going gradually to a world where our cars can spend more and more of the time we're in them driving themselves. So we'll have to do less and less of the driving, and it will sort of go from 100% now down to, you know, Elon Musk talks about 10% by 2025. And the car makers seem to think that they're just going to go on selling us cars that can drive themselves more and more and more. But I think we're actually heading for quite an important fork in the road, because once you get to a point where cars can drive themselves a lot of the time, the whole logic of car ownership changes. You could summon a car with your phone and it would show up and take you to the place you want to go, and then you'd get out of it. You wouldn't have to worry about parking. And if you did that, then the utilization of cars would go from about 5% now, so most cars are not used 95% of the time, to probably about 75%. And if you could do that, you wouldn't need to waste so much space on parking. So about a third of some US cities' surface area is parking space. So this has massive implications for the way you design cars. So this is Google's self-driving pod on the right there. No steering wheel and no pedals. Just an emergency stop button, that's the only control. Although they're being forced to add steering wheel and pedals by California for testing purposes, but their plan is to get rid of them. So you get into this car, you tell it where you want to go, and it takes you there. It's kind of bizarre that, you know, for most people, the second most expensive thing they own is this very large piece of metal that is mostly unused. And I think in 20 years' time, we'll look back on this and go, what were we thinking? I mean, this is mad. Anyway, the design can completely change. You can have a car that looks like that. It looks basically like a business class airline seat on wheels. And it doesn't need to have the controls and all that kind of stuff. You don't need to buy it, so car makers aren't selling you cars anymore. They're selling them to fleet operators who start to look rather a lot like mobile network operators. Insurance models change completely. You're not insuring the driver anymore. You're now insuring the network operator. You start to have roaming between your network operators when you go on holiday and things like that. That's going to be fun. And essentially, you summon the vehicle whenever you need it. And I think this is the long-term sort of logical conclusion of where this is going. It's not about your car being a bit cleverer and basically looking the same as the car today. That's the sort of horseless carriage fallacy. You know, early cars look like carriages without the horse. And then people realize actually you could make them any shape you like, and now they can look like Ferraris or Thunderbirds. So this is going to affect all sorts of things: car design, car ownership, insurance, city planning, logistics. You're going to have much greater mobility, you're going to have less congestion, you're going to need fewer delivery drivers and taxi drivers and so on. I think some cities will ban manually driven cars altogether on safety grounds. I also expect some to ban self-driving cars on safety grounds. I think we'll see quite interesting arguments about that. The main thing, though, is I think this is going to be an extremely disruptive technology. So who's best placed to benefit from it? Well, I'm not sure it's necessarily the car makers, unless they're prepared to think of themselves in a different way. Will they go into the fleet operation of self-driving cars? Will they start to think of themselves as transportation providers rather than sellers of large and expensive pieces of metal? Or will they just be very happy to supply those network providers? The really interesting players here are people like Uber. Uber already have a service that allows you to summon transportation using an app. Now, at the moment, it involves a human driving a car, but you don't necessarily need the human to be there. And so they have already got the infrastructure. They are already doing things like carpooling and ad hoc bus lanes. And there are various ways you can do this. So if you know that there are 3 people over here who want to go over here, then you send a vehicle that picks them all up and takes all of them and drops them off, and they all get a discount. And you can do this. It's essentially a dynamically generated bus route. This is the kind of stuff that is where this is heading. And it's actually people like Uber who are best placed to do it, because they've got the customers and they've got the evidence of where the demand is and that sort of thing. Okay, let's move on to another technology. We heard about this one. So that's basically digital technology applied to transport. This is digital technology applied to manufacturing. This is it looks like it's made of Lego. Actually, all the pieces you can see there were 3D printed separately, and that's why they've got little stripes on them. Lego's actually made to an incredibly high tolerance, so you couldn't 3D print it in its current form. These pieces have all been printed at 200%, and you can see they don't have the little writing that says Lego on the top. So it's pseudo-Lego. Anyway, 3D printing is an awesome thing, because although this is plastic, the really interesting stuff happens when you start printing in metal. So this is building up plastic with a sort of nozzle that squirts out a sort of glue gun-like nozzle. You'll have seen those, and there's a nice display of them downstairs if you want to go and have a look. So the metal ones are really interesting. You have a bed of metal, and you zap it either with an electron beam or a laser to melt together the parts that you want, and then the bits you don't want fall away as dust. And if you make, for example, aviation struts using this method, Airbus says you can 3D print parts that are 30 to 55% lighter. So you can make them with a bone-like foamy structure inside, which is incredibly strong and incredibly light. So they can be stronger and lighter and use less materials and require less energy and produce less waste, which is pretty amazing. There are other examples as well. There was a woman who had cancer of the jaw, and she had her jawbone removed, but beforehand it had been scanned, and then the 3D model of her jaw had been cleaned up to the way it ought to have been had she not had the cancer, and then a replacement jawbone was printed for her in titanium and implanted. Millions and millions of teeth, dental braces, are produced each year, and they're printed to order for individuals. My favorite example is actually the use of 3D printers by the Chinese space program. It turns out that Chinese astronauts have seats that are perfectly printed to fit their bottoms perfectly, so they're nice and comfortable when their rockets are taking off. And there are people looking at 3D printing food, 3D printing human organs, 3D printing buildings. There are even these amazing things that can 3D print buildings. So I think this is all very interesting and worth watching. But again, I think you have to think through the implications of this, and I think that we're looking at this in a rather short-term way. When you hear people evangelizing about 3D printing, they tend to assume that this is going to mean that all manufacturing comes back to the West. All of that manufacturing that went to low-cost economies like China is going to come back. Some of it will, but I don't think it's going to bring very many jobs with it, because these machines don't need as many people to operate as a traditional production line. The next thing is that people tend to assume that this is a sort of the enemy of mass production, and that it's mass production and production line technology versus 3D printing, and that only one of them can win. and this is wrong as well, what we're actually seeing in factories is 3D printing is hybridizing with existing manufacturing technologies. And the third assumption is that China is necessarily going to lose out here, and I don't think that's true either. As well as those Chinese astronauts with their seats, actually the largest 3D printer in the world is in China. It's in Dalian, and it's used to print aviation components, really, really big ones. This is how China wants to take on Boeing and Airbus. Boeing and Airbus are still very much in the, no, really, old boy, it takes much longer than you think to learn how to build these things, and we'll see who wins that one. So once again, I think we have to think about the who's going to win and lose from this. We have to think about how companies can reimagine what they actually do. And we saw this in the music industry. It was very bad at this. It thought it sold things in shops that were round and had a hole in the middle and had music on them. And actually what it did, what it should have been thinking, was that it delivered music to people. And then when it became possible to deliver that in digital format, it should have jumped on it, but it didn't. Similarly, if you think about what Lego does, Lego is in danger that people could pirate its products using 3D printing. In fact, I first became interested in it because my son wanted a minifigure, Lego minifigure of General Grievous, right? You know General Grievous, the guy with the forearms and the lightsabers? He's all one color, so you could 3D print him quite easily if the tolerances were high enough. And so I was thinking, can I get a 3D model of General Grievous on BitTorrent of the General Grievous minifigure? It turned out you couldn't, but I'm sure that will happen. So Lego could, in theory, head this off by saying, well, people think of us as a company that sells toys, but actually, we're going to sell you the ability to make your own. We're going to sell you the parts. We're going to sell you the plans for the toys so you can print your own. They could go that way. They could go into design tools. Actually, they're doing some very interesting things at Lego. They're trying to make 3D printing their friend instead of just trying to get people to pass laws banning 3D printers. They're doing things like they're trying to figure out how you could do rapid prototyping where you build some parts of something using actual Lego, and then you do the difficult bits. So you build the sort of superstructure using Lego, and you can build quite large things out of Lego, and then you do the difficult bits that you 3D printed and it slots in. And for sort of architectural modeling and things like that, it means you don't have to build a really big plastic thing on a 3D printer. You can just build the difficult bits and fit them together with Lego. So they're really thinking about this. But the question is, can people sell data, models of things instead of physical objects? Because that's the kind of thing 3D printing is going to allow them to do, and that's going to force companies to figure out what business they're really in. Let's move on to another one. This is data meets healthcare. The chart in the background is the cost per genome. So the sequencing of the human genome, the first genome, took a decade and cost $3 billion. You can now do it for $1,000 in slightly less than 48 hours. And this is a drop in price performance that is, or improvement in price performance that is much faster than Moore's law. So Moore's law is the white line, and the green line is the improvement for sequencing. This means that genomics, whole genome comparison, the NHS is currently doing this program to sequence 100,000 people, and then you can start to work out which genes correlate with diseases and so on. The problem is that it used to be the sequencing that was the hard bit, and it's now actually the data analysis because the computers aren't really keeping up. It's pretty hard. But the tools are improving. This allows you to do some very interesting things. It allows you to have digital healthcare. It allows you to start trying to work out what causes and effects really are. And when you throw in data from wearable devices like the Apple Watch and other things, there are all sorts of interesting new things that you can do. You can start to identify which diseases people are likely to be susceptible to. You can have them look out for particular symptoms. You can preempt. You can basically treat people, keep them well, rather than waiting for something to go wrong, which is much, much more expensive. So this is all great, but it threatens quite a lot of existing ways of doing things, in particular the health insurance model. The health insurance model assumes that we don't know who's going to get ill, but we're going to know who's going to get ill. That's going to make the people who are going to get ill uninsurable, and the healthy people who aren't going to have to pay anything. And the only real way around that is probably compulsory risk pooling, otherwise known as National Health Service style medicine, which is fine for us in Europe, where we already have that kind of thing, but is obviously political kryptonite in America. So that's going to be quite interesting. The other thing about this is, again, arena shifting. Who's going to win and lose here? And I think it's quite interesting that we're starting to see drug companies. GSK is doing this. GSK made a drug that only worked in about a quarter of people. I think it was for MS. And previously, we got used to the idea that drugs should work in everyone. Here's a painkiller. Oh, well, it doesn't work for me, that kind of painkiller. But blockbusters are drugs that you can test and they work in people. Well, it turns out that, for genetic reasons, some drugs will work in some people and not in others. And so you can start to tune the therapy, and this is particularly useful in cancer therapy. You actually sequence the tumor, and then you can work out which chemotherapies will work against it. Anyway, what GSK started to do, because they were trying to sell this drug to the NHS, and it wasn't working in most patients. So they said, look, tell you what, just pay us for the patients it works in. And then a light bulb went on, and they thought, wait a minute, this is selling an outcome rather than selling a drug. And this is what Rolls-Royce does with the engines. You know, it's selling hours of engine time rather than selling you the engine. And I think we're going to start to see an awful lot of that going on in medicine, that it's the data that's going to be really valuable, because it allows you to predict and optimize, and you can start to sell a service and an outcome rather than a thing. You can sell, you know, this many years of health rather than let's sell you lots of drugs. So we're going to see lots of new opportunities in gathering and managing and analyzing health data. And healthcare will depend as much on data as it does on biology today, if not more so. So this is really going to change the nature of the current setup in medicine, because it's going to be about prevention rather than treatment. Okay, another one. Mobile payments. You may have noticed Apple has this tendency to kind of come along every now and then and say, you know this technology over here that's kind of cool but a bit crap? Well, this is how you should do it properly. And they did that for graphical user interfaces, and they did it for music players. They did exist before the iPod, and they did it for smartphones. There were lots of smartphones before the iPhone. They just weren't any good, really. They did it for tablet computers, and they've just decided to bless mobile payments. So when Apple blesses a technology, generally, people go, oh, okay, that's the way to do it, and then everyone copies them. So we see, you know, all phones look like this, and everyone has an app store, and so on. So Apple's entry into this market, which they've been waiting to do for ages, is really significant. So NFC-based payment, and you walk up to a thing in the shop and you put your fingerprint on and it pays for it. It all sounds great. What does that mean, and how does it affect the payments industry, et cetera? Well, we can all have that argument. It doesn't affect the payments industry very much, actually, because this is, at the moment, just using your phone is a replacement for your credit card. This is very bad news for Square, because that's what Square does as well. So Apple just came onto their turf. Not bad news for PayPal at all. In fact, one of the reasons I think PayPal is being split off eBay today is it's now safe to do so, because we know Apple is not going after that market, or at least not yet. PayPal is an alternative to credit cards, and so you could argue that this is actually quite good news for them. Anyway, that's another story. I think there's more to this, though, than payments and, making it a little bit quicker when you're buying something. I think what's really interesting about this is you've got the biometric sensor that allows you to assert your identity and then do something. At the moment, it's just buying things, but I think what's really interesting about this is the potential to use this for other things. Now, the obvious immediate ones are you can use your phone as your house keys and your car keys. So people say that the things you always take with you when you go out are your phone, your wallet, and your keys, and your phone could be your wallet and your keys using this technology. But actually, we could go even further than that, and I liked what we heard earlier about data banks, because in Doctor Who, there's a thing called psychic paper. Does anyone here know what psychic paper is? So psychic paper is this incredibly useful plot device they have in Doctor Who. And Doctor Who has a wallet, and inside is a piece of psychic paper. And whenever he has to blag his way into, like a police station or an Egyptian pyramid or whatever, he holds up this thing. And psychic paper is something that shows you whatever you want to see on it. So if you're the doorman, it says, yes, I approve this person can come in. And if you're, or if you're a security man in a building, it says it's a security pass for that building. And this is a very clever idea. So this is actually what phones will be able to do. They'll be able to take the stuff from your personal data bank, and when you need to assert that you are a particular person and pass on a particular piece of it. So for example, the example is, suppose I'm in a bar and I get carded. And they say, no, we don't really believe that you're over 21. And I go, well, that's very nice of you, but I am, and here I can prove it. All that would happen is that I would assert that I am definitely the owner of this data using my phone, and the only bit of data that would get passed through from my personal data bank is the thing that the person in the bar wants to see, which is my age. And so that would be passed through. So it would be psychic paper. And I think this is what's really interesting about this. What's going on here. This is the beginning of that combination of personal data, of biometric verification, and of selective sharing of that data with different people. And I think that's much more interesting than payments. Finally, augmented reality. So we're getting a bit more blue sky here. This is where you overlay. This is much cooler than virtual reality. Virtual reality, you put the Oculus Rift goggles on, right? And then you walk around bumping into things. And it's kind of cool. I don't know if anyone's done the Game of Thrones Oculus experience. It's absolutely brilliant, but you're basically in a box, right? So augmented reality, you're painting data onto the world. So the device I want to be able to see who here is tweeting and someone there is tweeting, this is really boring, and then this person's tweeting something else. Or I want to be able to go into a room and see who I know, or maybe I'm an aero engineer and I want to, this is actually possible already. I open up a panel on an engine and the component that I have to replace is lit up for me in green. It's been painted over the world for me by my headset. Now, this is hard to do because you need head tracking, and you also need centimeter level indoor positioning. And we don't have any of those. Well, your head tracking's okay, but you feel a bit sick if it's not very good. So Google Glass doesn't do either of these things. It just shows you stuff in the corner up here. But when you can do both of those things, this is going to be awesome because you're going to be able to paint arbitrary data over the world. So, for example, you'll be able to make your commute on the way to work look like you're on Mars, and you'll be able to make your boss look like an alien, and you'll also be able to change the way other people see you. So there'll be sort of virtual jewelry. And the science fiction writers have figured all this out. There's masses and masses of science fiction in which this happens. Probably the best example of it is a book by Alistair Reynolds called The Prefect. It's very good, and it's about a virus that gets into this system, and it shuts down. And suddenly everyone has to look at the world the way it actually is. And it's absolutely brilliant. But there's this loss of virtuality. Anyway, what this means is if all this happens, you get an economy of people who sell overlays on the world, because that's what augmented reality is. Now, almost anything can be perceived as an overlay on the world. So fashion is an overlay on the world, and navigation is an overlay on the world, and guidebook makers are an overlay on the world, and art critics are an overlay. You could do video games that overlay on the world. So companies don't think about themselves as making overlays on the world, but an awful lot of them do. So this is the kind of thing that I think augmented reality will make possible, but it will require some brain stretching by people to figure out what business they're really in. Anyway, so I hope I've given you some idea of the technologies to keep an eye on. I may be wrong about some of them, if I'm bound to be. But the point really is to say that these technologies may appear not to have anything to do with your particular industry, but what did Kodak think it had to fear from telephones? Kodak had nothing to do with telephones. It got killed by telephones, basically. So I think that's a useful sort of toolkit to look at the world, and I also think that we need to think as companies that are trying to respond to these digital technologies, how can we re-evaluate the business that we're really in? Because we have to, I think, in order to prosper, companies have to be able to escape from the constraints of their own perception about what kind of company they are and what they do. Thank you. Happy to take a question or two if you have some.
So one or two have come in. Helen Kavanagh's asked, what impact do you think cryptocurrencies, I know you didn't cover it, such as Bitcoin will have on buying behaviours in the next 5 to 10 years?
Bitcoin's really interesting, and not because it's a currency. So if you ever try to buy anything with Bitcoin, it's a bit of a faff, to say the least. What's really interesting about Bitcoin is that it solves something called the Byzantine generals problem. So in the Byzantine period, there were lots and lots of generals, and they would all attack a city simultaneously from different angles. And in theory, they were all working together, but in practice, they all wanted to get to the treasury first and steal all the gold. So you have this difficult coordination problem, which is that you are trying to cooperate with people that you don't trust. And you've got a common enemy, but once that common enemy is defeated, you're all actually opposed to each other, so you're competing with them. So this is very, very hard to pull off. And so what you need is a system of distributed trust. Now, of course, it would be easy if you had instant communication and a trusted system where you could all write down what you were going to do and you could trust everyone else. So in other words, if you centralized under a single general, problem goes away. What Bitcoin does is it centralizes the maintenance of a trusted ledger, in this case about who has spent what, who's given money to who, in a way that doesn't require trusted infrastructure. So the Bitcoin ledger lives in the cloud, basically it lives distributed on the computers of the people running it. And that actually has much, much more wide application than just money. I mean, money is great, you can do money with it, but you could also use it to essentially trust, to build trust over sharing resources with complete strangers. And there are some potentially very interesting applications there. So I think that's it's the way that it solves that problem, in the same way that BitTorrent solved the distribution of content problem without having to have central servers. So it's a sort of peer-to-peer trust propagation system, and that I think is what's really interesting about it. So it looks really cool initially as a currency, but is a bigger deal.
Another one from Simon Horn, along with virtual currencies, PM and Apple Pay, do you see cash disappearing soon?
It's really hard to say. People really like cash. And if you look at what's happening, fewer transactions are being made in cash in America, so the actual volume in transactions is going down. But the amount of currency in circulation is going up, and this is because the amount of currency in circulation is predominantly in large denomination bills. So people are hoarding more cash, but they're spending less of it. So that seems to suggest that people mainly want cash as a store of value in uncertain times. So I think you've really got to solve those two problems if you want to get rid of cash. You can get rid of the transactional part of it quite quickly. But I think there are still going to be people who actually want to feel something. They don't just want a number on a screen. They want something that they can hold on to. And that's also the attraction of Bitcoin, I think, that it's out of the banking system, and some people find that more reassuring.
And there's a question here from Tony Dixon. How do we convince consumers it's really safe to share their data and that companies can be trusted with it? It's maybe one for Richard Horn later as well.
This is a really interesting thing that's in play at the moment. So who's on Elo here? Hooray, Elo people. So Elo is the new social network, and it is setting itself up as the anti-Facebook. The simple answer is it's not safe to share your data. Because the NSA will come and ask for it, and GCHQ will come and ask for it. If they don't come and ask for it, they'll just steal it. So what do you do about that? And it's worse than that. In fact, the entire business model of the internet is based on surveillance of everyone on the internet. And you know, the internet advertising is more accurately called surveillance advertising. It's based on surveillance. Facebook's business model is based on surveillance. Google's business model is based on surveillance. So what's really interesting is that in the past week, Elo has really taken off, and its manifesto is, we're not like Facebook because our business model is not based on surveillance. Instead of taking your data and using it to show you ads and giving you a free service, we're going to charge you, and then we're not going to give away any of your data. And I think that could work. Dropbox, for example, is funded by 4% of its users who pay $100 a year to use it. I'm one of them. I get a terabyte of storage for $100. That cross-subsidizes the other 96% of users. So I think you could do the same with Elo. You could have 4% of the users paying for, I don't know, the kind of stuff you pay for on LinkedIn. You know, who looked at your profile, better analytics, high-resolution photos, I don't know what. You can think of premium services you can add to it. Similarly, the other company that's made a very similar move this week is Apple. Apple sent out this open letter on privacy last week in which it made the point that it makes its money from selling products. It sells phones, it sells computers. It does not make its money by gathering your personal data and selling it and giving it to advertisers. Unlike a certain other company beginning with G, you might fill in. So in other words, Apple and Elo both think there is a business opportunity in saying to people, look, we are being honest about what's happening here. We are selling you a thing. You are paying for it. And there is no funny business with surveillance and giving your data to advertisers going on. Now, I don't know if there is a sufficient number of people who are sufficiently worried about this, that that's a big market. And we don't know how big that market is. Clearly, there are lots of privacy wonks who think this is really cool, but we don't know what proportion of the general public cares about this. But there is a scenario where you know, there's a massive privacy breach, say, at Google or Facebook, and information that's really embarrassing, starts to get let out in large quantities, and people go, oh, wait a minute, maybe I don't want to pay for using these services, using my data. Maybe I actually just want to pay money for them. And there's probably a mixture of the two in there. So I think that's a really, really good question. And I think for companies that are gathering personal data for reasons other than surveillance, they have to be very, very clear with their users and with their customers. And Apple is doing just this in the open letter on privacy, because Apple is not saying we're not going to gather your data. Apple's just saying we're not going to gather your data and then use it to target advertising at you. So Apple does want to gather your health data. It wants to be the repository for your health data, but its model is not based on then selling that data to people. Its model is, you gather that data, you can trust us to look after that data for you and only share it with the people that you want. And I think this is a really, really interesting distinction that's opening up between the companies who say, the reason we gather the data is so that you can have free stuff, but by the way, we'll give it to everyone. And the people who say, no, you can trust us, but you may actually have to pay for what you use.
No more questions. Thank you, Tom.
Great, thank you
very much.